Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Charleston Forum's 2021 panel discussion on criminal justice. Thank you all for joining us. The Charleston Forum is pressing forward with its mission of uniting our community and addressing issues of race together in the spirit of the Emanuel 9 and the other victims of that day who are still with us. Thank you for being a part of it. I want to thank our panelists today and our moderator, Carolyn Murray. Each one of them is a dedicated public servant in their own ways, and they're really making a difference in our community and are offering their time and expertise to allow us to do the same. And so thanks to each of them. Thank you also to our forum board members who have taken on this challenge of addressing this topic this year. And the primary leaders for that have been Lynn Pagliaro, Christy Danford, Reverend and Councilman Kylon Middleton, and our solicitor Scarlett Wilson. So thank you to those dedicated forum board members. Certainly can't go by without thanking our sponsors. We couldn't do any of this without the support of the sponsors. And I'd encourage every one of you, we welcome all levels of support, and you can make a tax-free donation on the PayPal link at our website. And even beyond that, we'd encourage you to share these videos that are found on our website on YouTube, and encourage any of the proposals that are shared with us today that you think would make a difference. You know, let's build some public support for them, more public support for them, and add more eyes to these videos so that we can help convince people that these are the right things to do. And so our sponsors this year I'd like to recognize include Samsung, the Patrick Family Foundation, the Al Hop Foundation, Ed Westbrook, Dr. Catherine Duffy, the Citadel School of Humanity, the Unum Insurance Company, John Reed, Dominion Energy, Duff Young Law Firm, the Joanna Foundation, the Charleston County Bar Association, the Henry and Sylvia Yashik Foundation, the law firm of Gallivan White and Boyd, another firm of Motley Rice, the Post and Courier Foundation, and the Sunshine Foundation. Thank you for your continued support. Now I'd like to get a program started and turn it over to our host, Christy Danford, who is the founding director of the Charleston County Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. Thank you all. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you all so much for joining us today as we dive into some very complex criminal justice system issues that have long had a largely disparate impact on communities of color here in Charleston, across the state, and throughout our country. Today's speakers will highlight key areas for improvement, which were also supported in the Charleston Forum survey conducted earlier this year by the Center for Research and Public Policy. It's also available on the Forum website. Crystal, if you click the slide. Notably, there was widespread agreement among a representative sample of 700 respondents across Charleston, Berkeley, and Dorchester counties. While I will provide a brief overview of the results for the purposes of the slide, I really encourage you to check out the full survey results. Today's discussion will highlight this information in four distinct segments. First, we'll discuss the role of law enforcement and accountability measures, such as racial bias audits and monitoring for excessive use of force. As you can see on the slide, survey data indicates a large majority of respondents support these measures, while we also see some varied responses from Black and white respondents. For instance, the composite score of 87% support for continuing education and training for officers on fair and even treatment, 85% support for de-escalation, and 84% support for continuing police departments developing programs in collaboration with Black and Brown communities to build trust and confidence. We also see 65% support for periodic racial bias audits, support that was stronger by Black respondents than white respondents. The second area of the conversation, if you'll click the slide, is going to talk more about criminal justice coordinating councils, such as the one we have here in Charleston County. Survey data indicates a large majority support for CJCCs with equal support in Black and white respondents. The third area of discussion is going to really dive into some areas of pretrial justice, issues that the CJCC has been diving into in recent years. We'll discuss pretrial detention, the role of money in our system, and the time it takes to bring cases to justice. Notably, survey data indicates that 74% of respondents support bail and bond system reform, so nonviolent offenders are not held in jail after demonstrating an inability to pay. 72% support supportive pretrial services for those least likely to make it to court and stay arrest-free. We also see 67% support for periodic racial bias audits of solicitor offices. These issues will get pretty rich, pretty deep, and pretty complex, but we're not going to stop there. The fourth segment we're going to talk about is really going to be about what it takes to reduce reoffending and how to carry out punishment and rehabilitation after conviction. As you can see here, survey data indicates a large majority with consistent responses from Black and white respondents support reentry programs that reduce recidivism. It should be a very rich discussion with some wonderful panelists, and we're so glad that you're here interested in this important topic. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Ms. Carolyn Murray. Carolyn is a longtime journalist and co-anchor. She began her journalism career in Charleston in 1988 as a radio broadcast and public affairs director. She's currently news director and co-anchor at Low Country CW Network. An effective and empathic storyteller, Carolyn has interviewed renowned leaders, entertainers, and athletes of local, national, and international prominence. She also serves on numerous boards, including the International African American Museum, and we're so grateful to have you here with us today. So welcome, Carolyn.
Christy, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to the Charleston Forum for organizing this event. And thank you, panelists, for your participation and lending your expertise and your experience to this conversation. And of course, to all of the guests who are watching and listening, thank you very much for making time in your day for this very important conversation. It is my pleasure now to introduce our panelists for this discussion. Jerry Blasingame is the Executive Director of Satoria Community Development Corporation. As the founder and CEO of Satoria Community Development Corporation, Jerry endeavors to empower individuals and the community as he advocates for economic and social justice through community and economic development. His passion is assisting people who've been incarcerated and helping them to become productive citizens. He's a certified reentry specialist through the Institute of Prison Ministry at Wheaton College, who advocates for systemic change on a state and national level while creating opportunity and independence for his nonprofit work through social enterprise. One of his greatest accomplishments was to help pass an expungement bill in the South Carolina legislature in 2018. He also serves as president of Correctional Ministries and Chaplain Association at Wheaton College. He's a 2019 fellow in the Aspen Institute's Healthy Communities Initiative and a 2016 fellow of Just Leadership USA. And he received the Buck Michael Award for Community Development from the Greenville Chamber of Commerce in 2019. Jerry Blasingame, thank you so much for being here. Dr. Lori Garducki is the Criminal Justice Director of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Since joining the foundation in 1991, she's focused on advancing juvenile justice and criminal justice reforms. In this role, Dr. Garducki has led development of models for change, an initiative that worked with government officials, legal advocates, educators, community leaders, and families to make juvenile justice systems more fair, effective, rational, and developmentally appropriate. And more recently, she helped launch the Safety and Justice Challenge, which gives support to local leaders from across the country to tackle the misuse and overuse of jails. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology and her PhD in educational psychology from the University of California at Los Angeles. Dr. Garducki, thank you for being here. Gary Rainey is the president of GAR Incorporated, and he recently authored the Use of Force report regarding the tragic death of Jamal Sutherland here in our local community. Sheriff Gary Rainey, he is retired, is the president of GAR based in Boise, Idaho. After retiring in 2015 from a 31-year career with the Ada County Sheriff's Office in Boise, he worked for the U.S. Department of Justice and privately helping law enforcement agencies improve their policies and practices to prevent in-custody deaths and lessen the frequency of force. He is consulted in 27 states in the United States and serves or has served on various state and national boards involving criminal justice reform. Some of his professional highlights include being appointed by the U.S. Attorney General to the board of the National Institute of Corrections, being the chair of the Idaho Peace Officers Standards and Training Council, the Idaho Criminal Justice Grants Council, the Washington, D.C.-based Pretrial Justice Institute, and the vice chair of the Idaho Criminal Justice Commission. He also served as the president of the Idaho Sheriff's Association. He has presented to thousands of criminal justice professionals across the country and abroad, but is especially proud of being asked to speak at NASA's Kennedy Space Center Leadership Retreat, as well as to the U.S. Congress. Gary Rainey, thank you for being here. Ninth Circuit Solicitor Scarlett Wilson was confirmed by the South Carolina State Senate August 3rd, 2007 to become the first woman to hold the office of solicitor for the Ninth Judicial Circuit. The citizens of Berkeley and Charleston counties elected Solicitor Wilson to hold the position in 2008 and re-elected her in 2012 and 2016 and 2020. Governor Sanford, Haley, and McMaster each have appointed Solicitor Wilson to serve as commissioner on the South Carolina Commission for Prosecution Coordination. In addition, Governors Haley and McMaster appointed Solicitor Wilson to serve as a member of the State Child Fatality Advisory Committee. She is also known as a tough but compassionate prosecutor, having won the Law Enforcement Victims Advocate Solicitor of the Year Award and the South Carolina Victim Assistance Network's Criminal Justice Award for outstanding service to victims. She has also played an integral role in the implementation of the Charleston County Safety and Justice Challenge Grant, awarded by the John D. and Catherine MacArthur Foundation. The goal of the grant was to keep dangerous people behind bars and to provide law enforcement and the court more options when dealing with lower risk, nonviolent offenders. Work began by the grant is ongoing and shepherded by Solicitor Wilson and other members of the Charleston County Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, or CJCC. Thank you again, panelists, for being with us this afternoon. We have 4 areas of concentration that we will talk about. The areas are law enforcement and accountability, the Criminal Justice Coordinating Councils, pretrial justice, and punishment and rehabilitation. We start with the importance of community expectations of law enforcement. We will talk about the level of policing that leads to community safety. And we will also look at the steps that you believe must be taken to achieve a culture of fair and equitable treatment in the criminal justice system. Mr. Rainey, we begin with you. Let's talk about racial bias audits that are becoming more common in police and sheriff's departments across the country. Give us an idea of what you have observed in these racial bias audits across the country.
Thank you, Carolyn. I appreciate it. And let me congratulate everybody on the existence of the CJCC and the Charleston Forum. What a great venue to make positive community change. I'm a member of a group here in my local area that has a tagline that says, nothing happens until people start talking. So again, kudos to you. So audits in their various forms really need to start with good data. Just like anything that we want to measure the progress or the lack of progress, we want data to back that up and objectify those efforts and measures. Unfortunately, in government, not just law enforcement, we often lack good data, especially if we're going to track the more human side of the business that we do. For example, we could track the number of arrests, we could track the number of citations, we could track demographics, but often in law enforcement, the impact to the community starts with the conversation on the street. Is a law enforcement officer respectful or disrespectful? Those things can't be tracked very well in data, but with the baseline of data, leadership can affect those measures. I've seen many instances where the chief or the sheriff resists reform, and there's some difficulties all over the country with that. That's a sad situation when that happens. To change the culture of an agency, which is really what we're talking about, is an understanding of the impact of human beings, not just on enforcing the law, then it starts with good leadership at the chief, the sheriff, the mayor, the county level, and the support for that. So that's really critical. Unfortunately, most government change happens through litigation. Whenever I try to help an agency, I say, let's avoid the litigation. Let's take this challenge on ourselves and try to deal with it. If we have data, if we have leadership, then we need to affect some training and some culture building. A lot of times, say implicit bias training, law enforcement officers may not really be aware of some of the prejudices that they have in the background of their mind, or the way that they may respond to somebody normal on the street if they're wearing civilian clothes, but very different if they're wearing a badge. That training and sensitivity is, I think, extremely important to build that culture. And lastly, we need accountability. There has to be the measure of that data. There has to be the accountability of the training and the culture building over time to really affect the change we want. Again, my goal is to help make that an internal change that is supported externally, but unfortunately, I often see that it ends up being an external pressure that makes the change happen.
Thank you. And Solicitor Wilson, one thing that Mr. Rainey mentioned was implicit bias training. I know that this is something that is mandatory in your office. Can you talk more about that?
Absolutely. 2 years ago, before COVID, I guess, we participated in the Race Equity Institute's training offered by the YWCA. And what I felt like that would do for my office, and it wasn't just the attorneys, it was the whole office that attended the training, so that we could really have an enlightened approach to our jobs. Education in South Carolina in particular, and maybe across the country, doesn't include a lot of the things that happened in our history. Some people say it's whitewashed. I don't know if that's the proper term or not, but I felt like we needed a good, solid understanding of how we got into this mess that we're in now, which is a situation where we have racial tension throughout every aspect of our lives. And I felt like we needed to understand that so that we could address that in the work that we do, because so many people see law enforcement and maybe even prosecutors as someone other than their friend. But we needed to make sure that people understood those things, and then go further than that, study it ourselves within our office, look at our own office and see if we had any sort of bias creeping in. I wasn't concerned about overt racists in my office, because I felt like if that were there, they wouldn't be there anymore. If I knew that I had that sort of issue, I know how to handle that. Implicit bias or unconscious bias, institutional racism, those things are a little harder to tackle, but you have to begin with looking in the mirror. And so law enforcement is often talked about as being at the root of these problems, fairly or unfairly. I'm very pleased, and the community should be very pleased, that our two largest agencies have undergone a racial bias audit. And I understand that the sheriff of Charleston County has agreed to do that as well. And my office has begun that process. And so I think that these things are important, just so that the people that the community is counting on to administer justice fairly have an understanding of where we've been and where we should go.
It's important that these audits happen, but what does it take for police agencies to bring some of these audit recommendations to fruition? Mr. Rainey, is that something that you can address?
Again, similar to what I said, an audit really should bring the agency information that it's unaware of, or again, objectifying some of that information. That's the goal. To make effective change, hopefully, if we were aware of everything that we're not doing well before the audit, we would have tried to make that change. So again, similarly, understanding the numbers, understanding not just the numbers, but what's the cause of the numbers. So for example, when we look at arrest data, it's often very difficult to just say one race is disproportionately affected by arrest more than another race. Why? What does that really mean? What is that in our community? What can we do to affect change? There's so many factors that go into the criminal justice and the actions of police, everywhere from economic stability, housing, education, advantage, disadvantage, police bias, police training. Really, I think that the audits and the data that come from them are really best used when they start the conversation about why do we have this information? Why are we doing this well? Or why are we not doing this well? And then how do we make this better?
Dr. Garduke, is that something that you would like to respond to in terms of watching how the result of an audit and then putting action behind the findings of an audit?
First, let me thank the Charleston Forum for convening this group and the support of the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council in Charleston for bringing together such a distinguished panel to address these issues. What I think is important to underscore, both in what the solicitor has said as well as Sheriff Ranley has noted, is the importance of creating a public forum in which to have these conversations. And it is not data in and of itself that are important, but its utility and value, its accessibility, and the ability of people from diverse perspectives and backgrounds to sit in a forum by which they can discuss these data. So it's not only a matter of accountability and transparency and operations, but then using those data to craft solutions. And so the audit, as the sheriff has suggested, is only the first step. And as the solicitor has pointed out, the response of the agencies is also critically important. But what is most important is its accountability and transparency to the people most impacted by the data that are reflected in the data and their stories. And so an audit is just the first step. And what has impressed me about the work that's ongoing in Charleston is its willingness to engage on the part of all of the different sectors, whether it's community members, impacted individuals, civic and faith leaders, is to really grapple with what does the audit say. And it's important to have those kinds of fora, not a town hall meeting, not just a listening session, but establishing the kinds of trusting relationships that are necessary to mobilize an entire community, not just the criminal justice system, to deal with the institutional, systemic, and structural causes that lead to the inequities and injustices we see in our society.
Thank you. The next question is for Mr. Blasingame. Mr. Blasingame, when do we need law enforcement to respond to critical situations, and when should they not be engaged? And is more de-escalation training the answer?
Yes, thank you so much, and thank y'all for having me. I want to start by saying I've been on both sides of the law. My mother was murdered when I was 5 years old, so I am a victim of violent crime. My grandmother raised me and told me about her life growing up as a Black woman in the South. When I was in college, I got arrested for the first time. And after that, I was arrested twice. Well, I think I've got 4 arrests, but the last sentence I faced was a 20-year sentence for drug conviction. So when is the right time for, law enforcement to come out is a great question, because when you have a child like me who have suffered from ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and when the police pull up on the corner in my neighborhood when I was a kid, he had no idea that I was a victim of violent crime, and the guys that are standing around me, we all had ACEs. No one knew. And so I believe that the proper training for police officers is very important. When 911 is called, they don't have the option to send out a mental health counselor. They just don't have that option. So you have to send out a police if a crime is being committed. So I think, that's one of the things that we need to look at is that type of training for officers while they're in the academy. You know, they need to understand, you know, what's going on in the communities. Our communities and Black communities are over policed. Why? Because there's a lot of crime going on, a lot of drugs. A lot of us are in the community medicating ourselves. And, you know, that's what we've done. You know, no one has told us anything different. So I think there needs to be a lot of training, you know, when it comes in the academy to help officers to understand the trauma, mental health issues. And also, you know, we need to look at the de-escalation training as well. You know, we need more of it because most officers do not know how to calm a person down. In most communities where crime is taking place, people cuss every other sentence. That's just what people do. They just cuss and they, you know, belligerent, not because they're bad people. That's just the way the culture is. And so, you know, if somebody cuss an officer or gets belligerent, of course the officer is going to probably get belligerent back, but trying to understand how to calm a person down. And I think that would be so important that we will have less arrests if, you know, we understand when and how to handle a situation when it comes to people on the corner or just into a neighborhood that's being over policed.
Thank you, Mr. Blasingame. And Solicitor Wilson, you recently released the report of your finding. This was the first ever equity report for Charleston, a comprehensive report about treatment and the perceptions of treatment, which is actually what Mr. Blasingame is describing right now, treatment and perceptions of treatment.
Right. And, you know, Carolyn, one thing I would point out is not just the first race equity report for Charleston. It's the first one for prosecutors in South Carolina. And I believe Dr. Garducki can confirm there are very few of these being done across the country because they're hard and prosecutors' offices aren't designed, their software systems, case management systems aren't designed for this kind of data collection. But we knew how important it was and we wanted to forge ahead. And unfortunately, with many high profile cases that you see across the country that come into our living rooms, people make their judgments on our systems based on anecdotes. And we just can't make policy changes through anecdotes. We can learn things about the law, like I learned in the Slager trial and Walter Scott's murder about the law. But we can't make broad policy changes or even suggestions based on a case here and a case there. And we can sometimes find ourselves celebrating changes that are made in response to a situation that happened in another state somewhere that we don't have that problem here. So fixing the quote problem that was never a problem isn't something that should be celebrated the way it is sometimes here. But I think, fortunately, again, I'm so glad it's being pointed out that at least in what I'm doing, this is a beginning of a process. It's not going to be the release of a report, the report's opened and closed and put aside. What we're trying to do on the transparency front is keep all of this information live on our website, update it periodically so that people, the media, watchdog groups, interested parties in the community, so that they can look at it, be a part of it, and raise questions. And we certainly know that not everyone is trained in how to read charts and graphs and percentages and formulas and things like that. But they can get enough out of these things to ask questions and to let us explain. And I'm very pleased to see that so far there doesn't look to be any statistically significant difference. There doesn't seem to be a difference in the way my prosecutors are treating Black people and white people. That said, we know based on the number of people that are arrested that Black people are arrested disproportionately to white people. Now that doesn't translate into racism necessarily, but it means that we need to look at that and we need to look deeper at what's happening and why certain groups of people are being arrested and others aren't, what's happening with those cases. And I'll give you an example. Again, we know that Black men are arrested many more times than white men. We see, however, in my office that Black men, their cases are dismissed at a much higher rate than white men for insufficient evidence. And I think that's pretty telling, that we have so many more people coming into the system. I mean, it's like a funnel. And that when my prosecutors are seeing cases that don't meet standards for prosecutions, they're getting rid of them. And they're getting rid of them in a number that points out that people may be being arrested on cases that they shouldn't be arrested on. And so once we deal or dig deeper into that data, what we can look at is which agencies mainly are responsible for that, what kinds of stops or situations led to those arrests, and why were those arrests made when there wasn't enough evidence to move forward with a prosecution. Understanding that law enforcement has a public safety responsibility out there on the scene, on the dangerous streets that we don't have in the calm cool of our office. Understanding that law enforcement makes arrests on probable cause, which means probably. And I tell people all the time, we don't want to send people to prison. We don't want to lock people up for days, weeks, months, much less years at a time based on probably. We need proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And what we're seeing is that an exponential number of cases against Black people don't have that proof. And that's something, that data, that collection is pointing us in a direction that we need to go, and we need to go hand in hand with law enforcement.
Thank you for that, Solicitor Wilson. And I'm going to ask this question, anyone who would like to respond, whether you, Sheriff Rainey, as a result of your history, and also Mr. Blasingame as a result of being on both sides of this, implicit bias and institutional bias. Is this kind of what Solicitor Wilson is talking about, though there may be no deliberate bias in the office, the result ends up being the same, that there are groups of people who are targeted more often, and as you explained, Mr. Blasingame, traumatized by their experience with law enforcement? Who would like to respond first?
I'll jump in and so, you know, that the word targeted, while it certainly happens and we need to recognize that, is not, from my law enforcement background, what we see more often. There are a lot of factors in the community, and as was mentioned, the pressure for a law enforcement agency to reduce crime, and the traditional way of thinking of most of our community members is that we reduce crime by arresting people. So we need to educate the community. We need to educate our law enforcement. The implicit bias is certainly a part of that, not being dismissive at all. We need to do all we can to erase that, but it's much broader than law enforcement to really impact the social issues around criminal justice. We're going to talk later about pretrial justice and those factors. It is critically important to me for the future of law enforcement to re-engage with the community. If we go back to 9/11, that's when our law enforcement effectively, the training changed from community policing to terrorist preparation, and we disconnected from the community. We need to re-engage. We need to re-engage in a way, like Mr. Blasingame said, in a way that helps us understand human beings more. And if we do that, then those human beings will also help understand law enforcement's role better.
If I could just chime in on that, Carolyn, the re-engagement with the community and the rehabilitation aspects of this. In the forums survey, and anecdotally in every speech I give to every community group, people are resoundingly in favor of rehabilitation. And that doesn't mean that nobody needs to go to prison, but people want others who've been convicted of crimes and who go to prison to come out of prison better than they went in. people understand that very few people are going to be locked away forever, and very few people should be locked away forever. But in the meantime, there have to be programs within the Department of Corrections, and there have to be programs within our communities that help people re-enter. And I have seen that shift over my career towards the community understanding why it's smart and why it's the right thing to do to help people get back on their feet.
Mr. Blasingame, you've actually participated in programs in which you've seen success.
Yes.
In this area that Scarlett is describing.
Most definitely, you know, and my program is one of them. Our, and I'll talk about this later in another question, but our program has a 4% recidivism rate. That's because we look at people as people. When I was in prison, people treated me like a human being, and it wanted me to treat people like a human being. And, you know, talking about implicit bias and things like this. In Greenville, City of Greenville Police Chief, we were on a panel discussion the other day, and he was talking about a new program that he has where he called NET, where they are actually going back to community policing. They don't call it community policing, but they're getting out of their cars, walking around the neighborhood and getting to know people, getting to know their neighbors. And when I was a part of the City of Greenville Public Policy Committee that the City Council put together and appointed me to, I made a comment, just a kind of a comment about, I wish we would get back to the days of Andy Griffith. You know, when Andy Griffith walked around, it was funny, but, you know, he heard that, you know, people loved each other and they cared for each other. That's what, you know, that's a TV show, but there's some reality to it when you care about people. We shouldn't just walk around with guns and just kind of bang, bang, shoot them up. You know, that's, you know, it creates something in little boys and little girls. And they're our future. If we don't do something now, we're in trouble. And so I'm thankful to have these conversations, but I wish every police department, sheriff department would think about community policing again, get back to getting out of their cars and engaging the community and not riding around in their cars looking at everybody like they're a criminal.
Thank you, Mr. Blasingame. Certainly, we are all familiar with the Andy Griffith show, but much more often these days, we hear more about excessive force when it comes to policing. Solicitor Wilson, let's talk about some of the implications of excessive force in terms of how it affects the community and also how it affects legislation.
Excessive force cases traumatize the community, and they damage, you know, one law enforcement officer committing misconduct, hurting someone else is just tremendously damaging to other officers, to prosecutors, to cases that we're bringing forward. It has a significant impact. And again, it becomes the thing that is fresh in people's minds and causes people to form impressions based on one event, one anecdote, when the situation may not be widespread. However, and that's what I was saying earlier, we can't make decisions just based on that anecdote, that one video of bad policing. When we do have that, and when we do move forward with an investigation or prosecution, and we learn about weaknesses in our laws, they need to be addressed. And that's why I've been talking for years about the fact that South Carolina does not have an excessive force statute that addresses force by law enforcement. We have the same statutes that apply to any other citizen, of course, but when the community, the government arms people, men and women wearing the uniform, wearing the badge, gives them a weapon, tells them to run towards danger, trains them almost exclusively on using force versus how to get out of using force, we find ourselves in a situation where when there is a bad apple, when there is a terribly unfortunate situation, we don't have good statutes to hold bad apples accountable. And it was really a shame that in the prosecution of Michael Slager, when we got to the part of the trial where the judge was to give the jury instruction, The defense didn't know what the legal standard was for the defendant's state of mind. We didn't know what the legal standard should have been. And there was a, half day to day long hearing about what the standard even was. Everybody, all of the media and onlookers from afar assumed that it was Tennessee v. Garner, assumed that we had a reasonable officer standard, and we don't. And we need to codify the state of mind that's required to hold an officer accountable when they commit misconduct. We need to have special or graduated penalties within that. So, not because we want to make every cop out there a criminal by any stretch, but we need to catch up with the rest of the country when there are, I think, 43, 44 states that have laws that specifically address law enforcement misusing force, using excessive force, and we don't have one. And we've had trials. Many states may not have even had an excessive force trial like we've seen here. We've seen it, we've walked through it, and we know how that ends. And it's going to keep ending that way until we have a statute on the books that law enforcement can understand, that prosecutors can understand, more importantly, that juries can understand.
Thank you for that, Solicitor Wilson. We have a lot of comments coming in, and I want to make sure that we allow our viewers and listeners to participate in the discussion. And so I want to right now share the issue is regarding eliminating incarceration as a form of punishment. We've gotten several comments about abolitionists. So if there's someone who wants to discuss looking at the idea of eliminating incarceration as a form of punishment, is that something you would like to take on, Mr. Blasingame?
Sure. I've had these discussions many a times, and because I have been in prison and been around a lot of people, I've had people to tell me that I don't need to go back into society. And I know they say that because they haven't had the proper help. Most of the people in prison that I've seen are mental, they have some type of mental illness, or they were criminalized because of their poverty. I think if society would do a better job as helping children, and we can do a better job as except for just giving money to people and just helping people with financial literacy, and just and if it's taught in school, we could eliminate a lot of crime. As we all know, we are incarcerating people who are poor and people who are mental ill, and so I think eliminating the prison system may not be really good, because there are some people who are sick, but we could have a lot less people in prison if we work on the front end first, do a lot of those things that we need to do. And I think government and our criminal justice system is doing too much. Good parenting, good schools. I love the public school system. I love teachers. I have the greatest respect for teachers. And so I think we need to put more focus on those areas and a lot less focus on criminalizing people.
Thank you. We talked a lot recently and heard a lot in recent years and months about the criminal justice coordinating councils and the focus on the importance of community expectations for local justice systems and gaps to address disparities in policing and law enforcement. So let's talk about the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, or CJCC, what these are, what they need in the community. We'll start with you, Sheriff Rainey.
I think it is the effective way to change the justice system. One of the dynamics that I have seen all over the country is if only one or two or three elements of the criminal justice system are trying to affect change, often they get the blame when something goes wrong. And what I've seen most commonly is that somebody was released pre-trial without money bail, or maybe released early from probation or parole, and that one person out of 100 or maybe 1,000 ends up committing a serious crime, often murder, and then that blame comes back to the judge or to the prosecutor for not arguing for a harsher sentence, or to whatever entity might have been working toward that criminal justice reform. And politically, most of these positions are elected. And so when you get a community that says, oh, they're soft on crime, they let this person out, this person was murdered, this family was victimized because of these reforms, a criminal justice coordinating committee can help alleviate that, because it's all aspects of the criminal justice system, or the core aspects, the government aspects of the criminal justice system, that come together and talk things through, and will stand behind each other, because those situations where somebody was released or the opportunity was there to commit a crime will happen. But when that criminal justice coordinating council stands behind the decision, stands behind the person, and recognize, for this one case that didn't go the way that we wanted, and sadly somebody was victimized, what about the 1,000 cases where somebody is now successful and employed and supporting their family and involved in our community? Those are the give and takes. We can't incarcerate everybody. As Mr. Blasingame said, and I couldn't agree more, we incarcerate far too many people now. But to get to the effective local solution, we need our local leaders coming together. And that's what a criminal justice coordinating council does so effectively. Yours is evidence of that.
And
Dr. Garducki, can you talk? Pardon me, Solicitor Wilson, go right ahead, please.
Well, I just wanted to piggyback on that, and that goes back to what I was saying about anecdotes. We do need to make reforms in the criminal justice system, and during those reforms, and even if we get to a place where everybody agrees we can be, there will be outliers. There will be the one case where someone hurt someone else after being released on bond or released early. That doesn't mean that overall the program hasn't been good, it hasn't been effective, and it hasn't overall reduced crime in our community. So both ends of the spectrum can't be judged on outliers. However, when there is an outlier, we can learn from it. And I think we have in the cases that we've had here locally. And I think that we can, as we move forward, trying to make some of the changes that the CJCC is working on.
Dr. Garducki, I know that you have very closely examined the Charleston County CJCC. Can you talk more about what you believe their work has done, the impact on the community, and its potential?
I want to pick up on what Sheriff Rowney said, as well as build on what the solicitor has said, in that the criminal justice system is actually not a system. As the sheriff noted, they're independently elected officials. So the judges, I'm not certain of the laws in South Carolina, but are frequently elected. The solicitors are elected. The county commissioners are elected. The police chiefs are appointed by a duly elected mayor. And unfortunately, the incentives and rewards and how they think about their performance doesn't often align with respect to the best interests of the community stakeholders and taxpayers who should be holding them accountable. As the solicitors pointed out, their data are often not shared. They operate in silos. And so the criminal justice coordinating councils are a mechanism to ensure that the system stakeholders are all sitting at the same table, and more importantly, are being held accountable by the community. And that community representation could not be overemphasized. It's critically important and valuable to have the people most impacted by the system sitting at the table, sharing power, looking at the same data and coming up with the solution. And what impressed me with respect to the I'm not certain whose phone needs to be muted. There we go.
Okay.
In any event, what has impressed me about the Charleston Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, the CJCC, is that it was an organic process. As they Charleston was one of 191 applicants from jurisdictions in 42 states across the United States that applied to participate in the Safety and Justice Challenge. The Safety and Justice Challenge was a springboard for them to tackle systematically, holistically, and comprehensively what a fair, more just, and equitable criminal justice system should be. And by that is, how should it respond to people in conflict with the law in the best interest of protecting community safety? And what they saw was the ways in which the discretion of these separately elected officials operates in such a way that it was disproportionate often to the harm that is caused or had absolutely nothing to do with community safety. And by talking about the problem, looking at the data, involving the community, and then thinking about the specific policies and practices that needed to change in terms of what are the drivers of over-incarceration and racial inequities in Charleston, they identified some very specific policies and practices that could be changed in terms of what kinds of charges were subject to arrest as opposed to warnings, when were summons in lieu of arrest appropriate, and even for those arrested, when it was appropriate to book them into jail. And for individuals who were booked into jail at their first appearance, that they had access to a public defender who could make their case about why they could safely remain in the community while they were awaiting trial. It also looked at other problems upstream or downstream rather in the system in terms of the court's ability to hold timely trials. Why was it individuals are languishing in trial long past an appropriate national standard in terms of when a trial should be held? And that's justice delayed is justice denied. It also provided options in terms of deflection and diversion. Instead of arresting someone and bringing them to the jail, they set up a crisis stabilization center. They made greater efficiencies in terms of how cases are handled. And they also shared this information in an ongoing way with the CJCC, where there is community representation and voices of the most impacted individuals, hearing about the potential solutions and debating what was most appropriate, as well as ways to repair the harm that is caused by a system that is unjust and unfair. There's still a long way to go, but now there's a public forum and a vehicle to address this in an ongoing way. Relationships have been built, trust is being established, and hopefully some of the restorative practices that are necessary for healing, not just addressing the harms, but changing policies and practices in the culture going forward are in place. So there's much to applaud about what's going on in Charleston. I've seen many CJCCs in counties across the United States established, but none quite as dynamic and as instrumental in making changes as what I've seen in Charleston, and that they can very quickly simply be, a public forum where no action is taken. And I think that's what's been most impressive about Charleston is how seriously they take the charge in terms of what does it mean to have a fair, more just and equitable response to people in conflict with the law, and whether in fact the law, the court's corrections are the appropriate response in terms of problems that are clearly systemic and structural in nature.
Dr. Godicki, the MacArthur Foundation has supported the Charleston community, but how can these councils be replicated in other communities?
That's a good question, and it's one where we ourselves are documenting what this success looks like, and that the whole aim of the Safety and Justice Challenge is recognizing that local problems require local solutions, but it's a problem national in scope, that we want to hold up Charleston as a model for other local jurisdictions. So we have a robust set of communications and knowledge development activities that are wrapped around the 50-odd jurisdictions that participate in the challenge. We're also seeking to partner with other funders, including federal funding, to say these are models that should be replicated, and so that they don't have to go through the same learning and growth and development curve that Charleston has experienced, but can move more quickly to put these in place and know what the parameters are, know the ground rules, and which are still evolving in Charleston in terms of balancing the community perspective along with the system stakeholders perspective. But what I want to emphasize is that these changes that we've been talking about that have reduced the jail population, unfortunately, they haven't been as successful in reducing racial and ethnic disparities, but the harm has been reduced and better outcomes for people of color have resulted, is that there's a need to tackle this jurisdiction by jurisdiction. There's no one way to accomplish this.
And just speaking of this CJCC, Christy, I know that you presented some slides earlier, and if you have an opportunity, if you could show us an example of some of the work the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council has been doing locally as we move into our next area of focus, and this area is pretrial justice. But if you could show us some of the work and show us some of those slides that bring to mind and speak to some of the work that CJCC has been doing in Charleston and speak to that. Christy, if you are able to do that.
Sure, I'm happy to. And while Crystal tries to pull up the slide, I can just sort of speak off, some of the things that Dr. Garducki was talking about in terms of, making deliberate decisions to not bring people to jail. There you go. To not bring people to jail, particularly charges that were most frequently booked and lower level charges that were headed to municipal or magistrate courts, charges that were disparately impacting the Black community, like simple possession marijuana. I mean, those are some pretty significant changes made by our law enforcement leaders that reduced the bookings, for instance, for simple possession marijuana as a single charge by 93%, did cut the local jail population by 38%. What used to be a jail population that was most frequently being booked for charges headed to municipal or magistrate court is no longer, right? Now the most frequent charges coming in are heading to the Court of General Sessions. What we see in our jail now is that our jail population is definitely smaller, and it is primarily pretrial, folks that are awaiting court on at least one charge. And the majority of those are sitting and waiting for court in the Court of General Sessions. It should also be known that most people awaiting court in General Sessions are not in jail, they're in the community. Some of the studies that we've been able to do, have really looked into the pretrial space to see what happens when folks go through, right? So what we see is that the majority of defendants do release while their cases are pending. Most that release are in lower levels of risk, and most succeed while they're waiting for court. However, there is a minority that routinely fail while on pretrial release, meaning they get rearrested or they get violated for missing court. What we know about that population is that the failure rates are increasing as the risk levels increasing. We see that rearrests are happening most often within 6 months of release. And we see that folks that are released on financial bonds are failing more often than those that are released on their own recognizance. And the CJCC has, as was stated earlier, put in some measures, right? Things like having public defender representation, having pretrial service reports so the judge has, some more information to help make those critical decisions, doing some things in bond court to continue to monitor it and ensure just and meaningful practices. Still, we face some long-term challenges, not just here in Charleston, but around the state when it comes to case processing. And these challenges have become even more exacerbated during the pandemic. So for example, the median time, so the middle number of days that it takes to go from arrest to a disposition in the circuit court is approximately 500 days. That's the middle number. And the backlog of cases pending, awaiting their day in court has been gradually increasing, not just here in Charleston, but around the state. So we've got some significant pretrial challenges ahead of us. And I hope this data is helpful for the next stage of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christy. Dr. Garducki, let's talk about the bail bond system nationally. What have you observed about some challenges? Who's doing it well and who's failing when it comes to this system?
It's been interesting since the Safety and Justice Challenge was launched in 2015 to see the increased attention being paid to the money bail system in this country, where people unfortunately are locked up because we've criminalized poverty. And the interest in creating alternative systems and having other mechanisms for making that determination of, rather than simply based on a charge and the amount of money a person can pay has led to an interesting debate and discussion. We have some states that have already set forth on eliminating cash bail or simply limiting its use, and in New Jersey, in New York in particular, and recently the state of Illinois, where the foundation is located, passed the Pretrial Fairness Act recently, which will eliminate cash bail. So I'm encouraged that we're thinking about what is a more fair and just way to address these issues. And as Christy suggested in commenting on where you all are in Charleston and specifically but in the state of South Carolina, cash bail can set up some odd and unusual incentives. The fact that people who are released on their own recognizance are more likely to make it to their trial date, I think is a point worth noting. There is also certain pretrial practices that could certainly reduce the number of people who fail to appear in court, such as automated court reminder systems. It can be as simple as providing someone who lacks a cell phone where they can be in touch to find out when their court appearance date has been set. That is having public defenders available at first appearance and having an opportunity to interview that person to ensure that they are in a position to know when their court date is and return to court. And for some individuals, giving them the option to participate in treatment and programs that can help keep them safely in the community should be an option. We know in Illinois specifically, where there has been bond court reform, which was our precursor of eliminating cash bail, that significant amount of funds were retained in the community instead of going to the bail bond industry, and that those individuals who were released on their own recognizance showed up for court and were not later arrested for more serious offenses, and that the jail population in Cook County declined significantly as a result of that. And having that information was critically important as the legislature then took further steps to eliminate cash bail. In places like New York, they're even going further to saying, as you must remember, a person is innocent unless they're proven to be guilty, that even those who are charged with more serious offenses should be eligible for release into the community under supervised release programs. So I see greater willingness to be innovative and institute policies and practices that will enable folks to remain in the community while awaiting trial. And because we know even short stays in jail have adverse consequences. Not only can it jeopardize custody of one's children, interrupt their schooling, or result in someone losing their housing or their jobs. We know that those individuals who are unnecessarily incarcerated in a response in this country that has been automatic and mechanical without thought to the harm, that we know that they're also more likely to receive a more serious sentence. As one person noted, in the United States, we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the people who are incarcerated.
Well,
and the predominantly people of color.
Thank you for that. We are talking about the bail bond system right now. Solicitor Wilson, what will it take? And I know that this is something that you've been very passionate about and very vocal about, reforming the bail bond system in South Carolina.
Again, we need reform on both ends of the spectrum. And fortunately, through the CJCC, there has been, through the will of law enforcement, the courts, my office, there has been an effort to institute some of those reforms without statutory changes. I think people, through learning, through research, through the data, are seeing that it's not healthy, it's not productive to keep people in jail pretrial simply because they're poor. And that's why you've seen such a change in the numbers for people who are booked into jail or remain in jail for low-level offenses. The work of the CJCC really hasn't gotten the credit it has deserved for affecting that change without a statutory requirement. I'm all in favor of changing the way we set bail bonds, but we've got to have something else. Dr. Garducci referenced pretrial services. We have no pretrial services in South Carolina, none. So until the legislature is ready to fund that, we can't give up bail bonds, cash money bonds. We can be smarter about it, as we have been in Charleston County. On the other end of the spectrum, we have a real problem with people getting out on violent offenses and continuing to get arrested and released over and over and over and over on violent offenses. That doesn't do anyone any good. It bogs the system down. It victimizes people, and that needs to change. We need to have real methods for bond revocations, and we need to hold bondsmen accountable who continue to bond people out and to foot the bill for someone to be released from jail, knowing that they're a high risk and knowing that they continually to get arrested. The other problem we have with bail bonds here in South Carolina is there's no requirement for what a bondsman has to get before he posts the bond. So you could have $1 million bond on a charge in South Carolina. A bondsman may take $10, may take $100. There's no set standard for how much a defendant or his family or her family has to offer a bondsman or put up with a bondsman in order for the bondsman to post bond. And there have frankly just not been enough consequences for bondsmen who aren't helping keep their clients in compliance. There are good bondsmen out there, and the good bondsmen want their clients to succeed, want them not to get in trouble again, and to help see that that happens. And that's kind of how a pretrial services would work. And that's why I say we can't give up on bondsmen without pretrial services on the other hand. But the ones who aren't doing their job, the ones who aren't monitoring the GPS monitor, who aren't reporting violations, who continue to post bond for people who continue to get in trouble, those bonds need to be estreated on occasion. And the bail bond industry needs to step up and really do their job. So we need reform on both ends. We're lucky here in Charleston County that on the front end with low-level offenders who aren't a real threat to the community, that law enforcement, judges, and our office has really embraced that idea, and our jail isn't being used the same way that it was in the past.
The pandemic, let's take that as a factor in all of this. Is that one of the things that's creating an even greater backlog in the system, if you will, right now, Solicitor Wilson?
Certainly, but I don't think we need to let the quote system off the hook because we were in trouble before the pandemic. And it's just exacerbated the problem. And the judges take a lot of heat for that. And sometimes I give them that heat, but to be fair, they got tasked with handling the criminal docket now. And they got tasked to do that job with very few, if any, additional resources. So when the solicitors manage the docket, subject to the control of the judge or judges, we had, in essence, 50 lawyers managing their dockets. You know, it wasn't just one centralized person trying to manage a docket of thousands of people. So when it went to the court handling it with no additional resources, it's too much. And we've seen not just in Charleston County, but in counties across South Carolina who performed well. When the court took the docket over, it just was a backslide. And so then you have the pandemic where we can't get into court or couldn't for a while. And you have cases stacking up just on top of each other. And it really is a crisis. We don't have uniformity in case management. Both the solicitors, the public defenders, the private bar, and some judges got together, hammered out a docket bill that didn't make anybody happy, which probably meant it was a good one. Got it through 2 readings of the Senate, and then it was killed, and it's never been heard of again. There has to be some guidance on how to run the courts for the judges, and the judges have to do a little better at collaborating with us in the defense so that we aren't wasting precious court time. And as a result of our audits, we're going to have to triage cases. And I believe, based on the forum survey, there's some support for that. For non-victim cases, cases where the community is not in danger, but cases that are holding up the murders, the rapes, the more serious cases, holding them up from getting into court. We're going to have to find an alternative for dealing with them, whether it's diversion, whether it's a dismissal right out, you name it. We're looking at all of that. Nothing is off the table there, so that we can be more effective and efficient in holding violent offenders accountable.
Do you know actual numbers, Solicitor Wilson, in terms of the number of people waiting right now? And also just looking at, you're talking right now about some of those nonviolent offenses. What kinds of offenses are you talking about specifically?
Low-level drug offenses, law enforcement initiated type crimes. There are some driving offenses that are administrative, that don't have anything to do with driving under the influence or reckless driving, things like that, but have to do with parking tickets or failure to pay, again, getting back into the poverty situation. Things like that, where we can look to other places and see that public safety was not compromised by diversion or dismissal. Again, low-level drug offenses, marijuana cases in general, those types of things we'll have to look at.
Is there any effort to decriminalize some of these offenses?
I think there's an effort to change the penalties that are involved, to change whether or not it's a civil fine or a criminal penalty. I think there have been some efforts with that in the legislature, and I'm not going to take it upon myself to decriminalize some of these things, but I do have to prioritize. I do have to realize that we have only so much court. We have some very serious violent offenders, and we have public support, I believe, especially when it comes to low-level possession type cases, not drug trafficking, not guns and drugs. People who are addicts or people who are recreational users, finding other ways to deal with them than wasting precious court time.
Thank you. We are moving into the area now of punishment and rehabilitation, and the focus on the importance of the community's expectations of punishment, rehabilitation, and some of the gaps to be addressed in order to achieve a culture of fair and equitable treatment. This first question is for you, Sheriff Rainey. What have we learned about reducing recidivism nationally?
As sheriff, I came to recognize that my job was community safety, is helping improve this community, and it wasn't just about arresting people. So as I came to understand more about the research, more about the evidence, it is not just protecting somebody, a victim who was a crime was committed, but as was talked about earlier, that offender is about 98% likely to return to the community. What can we do to return that person and make them law-abiding, productive, employed member of our city? So we know that factors like employment and housing and having social support systems, all of those are very important to reducing recidivism. When people go to jail, it breaks those ties to some degree, sometimes 100%. If I have a minimum wage job and I get arrested and I stay in jail for 3 or 5 days, I've probably lost that minimum wage job. So the outcome of that is really exactly the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish. And on recidivism and rehabilitation, we often think of rehabilitation as a function of the Department of Corrections on the tail end of the sentence. I think we need to re-envision that and say that rehabilitation often should start at the time of arrest or at the time of criminal justice contact. So many crimes involve mental illness and substance abuse. From that initial contact, we should start changing that focus rather than waiting those 500 days before we really get a sentence and somebody starts on some path of rehabilitation. Why not start it up front? Why not avoid those 500 days? So we really, I think the traditional way of thinking when I started in law enforcement almost 40 years ago was that success was arrests. We reported arrest rates, we reported the rates we solved for various crimes, and that was what was in the media, that was what was in the community, that's what's tracked by the FBI. I think as we develop our systems and can begin to think about how do we track the overall recidivism rate, and that should be the measure of success. And how we get there is stopping the categorical thinking of this person committed a burglary, or this person committed an aggravated assault, or this person committed whatever the crime. And so therefore, the opportunity for release or the opportunity for services is really based on the severity of that crime. We need to individualize that. We have tools now that are starting to look at that individualized risk assessment, the individualized risk and needs assessment for what that individual needs to be successful. The research has been amazing over the last 10 to 15 years that is bringing that forward. So we need to start early on and start understanding that individual. We need to think about the victim of that crime absolutely through this process, but the goal has to be returning that offender to the community as early as possible with the greatest success possible.
Thank you, Sheriff Rainey. Mr. Blasingame, Sheriff Rainey described support, education, vocational training, those kinds of things to reduce recidivism, but there's a cost that comes along with all of that.
Yes, I've been running a reentry program for over 20 years. And back when I first started, I didn't have any money. No one wanted to invest in a Black man with a criminal background who was starting a nonprofit. And, you know, that's the case. And so I had to figure out how to make my own money. So we became a community development corporation. We created our own small businesses. We started building and developing low-income housing. And also the guys in our program were being employed by the organization. And so we created our own model. And so it's very expensive. So we need to find a way to fund these activities too. A lot of funding is going into research. I appreciate that. It's very good, but we need money on the ground. I believe that those of us who have been impacted by the criminal justice system, we need to be at the table as well. Just like in this group, there are 5 or 6 of us here. I'm the only impacted person on this panel. There should be one impacted person per professional on this panel, because I believe we are professionals as well. That's one of the ways that also that we can help this problem, paying for it and kind of getting and training people who've been previously incarcerated. Those who are closer to the problem or closer to the solution, but furthest from the resources and the power. There are so many of us out here, but we just don't have the resources and power to sit at the table. And so I think once we begin to get people like myself at the table, more of us, we can begin to reduce recidivism, but we've got to have people with power and money to invest in us and our community as well.
Thank you so much for that. This question is for anyone who would like to respond, and it is, if more communities can right-size their jails and our pretrial justice system, as we've talked about over the last few minutes, is improved, what might that mean for people who are serving sentences in state facilities right now?
I think this goes to, and I want to endorse both what Mr. Blasingame and Sheriff Rainey has said about the importance of having people most impacted by the problems at the table to seek the solutions, as well as the sharing of power and money, and making decisions about de-investing and investing a community situation, rather something that the CJCC, I think, in many respects fulfills. But what I've witnessed is in working in this area, first in juvenile justice and now in criminal justice, is how this conversation about community safety, and I purposefully use the word community safety, what does it take to make people feel safe and secure and lead healthy and productive lives? It's something that everyone needs, whether you're the citizen returning to the community, having been incarcerated, or what is necessary to keep people from cycling in and out of jail, whether you are a crime survivor or you have been someone who has been involved in a crime as the offender. And I think if we seriously take this notion of shrinking the footprint of the criminal justice system and moving upstream to address the systemic and structural issues that have led to inequities in our society, that overall everyone would be better off. And more importantly, we wouldn't have lost the human capital and resources that are needed to have successful and thriving communities. So I'm not saying that looking at this from the criminal justice lens is an end in itself. It's simply a starting point, a way to leverage a discussion of what we should be looking at upstream from the problem that results in people being in conflict with the law.
Thank you. We have questions that came in from members of the audience, and I want to make sure that we allow people to be a part of our discussion. And so I will ask them, and anyone who would like to respond, certainly you are welcome to. And the question is, what do you believe police departments can and should do differently to prevent or mitigate those opportunities for racial profiling and racism? Who would like to respond?
I'll just start off briefly by reiterating, because this is my world again, leadership, community leadership, agency leadership, political leadership, being able to track data, meaningful data, have it be transparent, bring the community into the agency, and let them understand what's happening, let them be part of the solution, giving feedback, listening to that feedback. Really, my simple answer is we need a very holistic approach to addressing this issue, because it happens across the country in every community.
Thank you. Another question that came in, has there been any data or expert observation on the impact of open carry in South Carolina?
I haven't seen anything on that yet, and haven't seen any sort of trend. Certainly, we've been on pins and needles about it, and hopefully we won't see anything, but I don't know if there's anything nationally. Ours is pretty new. I think it went into effect mid-August, so it may still be a little early.
Okay, thank you. Another question, what is being done to encourage or incorporate positive interactions between law enforcement agencies and citizens of color? What have you observed or perhaps even participated in?
Well, I can speak to that. As I mentioned earlier, what we're doing in the city of Greenville, our police chief has just started a new program where his officers are getting out, interacting with the community, and it's a great program. It's only a month or two in, but we're getting rave reviews right now from our citizens that they feel like they really are being cared about, and not just a number or just a spot on the map. So I think that's very great that we're doing that, and I think other police and sheriff's departments should follow that model.
Thank you very much. Well, panel, I'd like to thank you again for your participation in this robust discussion. I've learned a lot. Thank you for sharing your personal experiences as well as your expertise in this area. I'm sure that our guests our viewers and listeners have had an opportunity to learn a lot more about how we can work together as a community, things that need to change and things that we also need to work hard to make sure never happen again. I'd like to extend an opportunity for each of you about a 1 minute or less closing statement about work that you will continue to do in our community, what we can look forward to seeing you do, and also some takeaways perhaps from this discussion. Again, less than 1 minute as we hope to stay on task to end our discussion at 1 o'clock. Whomever would like to start first.
I'll start. I think, one of the things that, collateral consequences are things that continue to punish people, once they are, released, nationally are 48,000 collateral consequences, 7,000 in the state of South Carolina. I myself who got out of prison and wanted to go back and finish my college degree, could not get a Pell Grant because of a drug conviction. And that was crazy. I couldn't get a license as an architect. I was studying architecture in college. I couldn't get licensed because of that as well. And I think, things like that, we need to look at those things too, is that once people complete their sentence and are law-abiding citizens, they need to be able to work and live and go to school and do things. I think that's something, that we need to look at. I fought 13 years to help get an expungement bill passed. 13 years. And everybody said, no, we want to know what's on people's records, but it doesn't make any sense, for a person like me who's a productive citizen, who've been doing things and helping people. I was helping people when I wasn't even helping myself. And I have a pardon and my record is still not expunged. And I've helped over 5,000 people in the last 20 years to get their life back together. So we do have a problem, broken system.
Thank you, Mr. Blasingame.
I can go next. I think that Mr. Blasingame makes a really good point, and I think that through the work that we're doing with the CJCC and the data collecting that we're doing, we can support many of those things. Our expungement laws, although there have been some changes recently, we can change some more so that people can make a meaningful living when they're reformed and rehabilitated. For our office's part, we're going to continue doing this race equity work in all aspects of our office. We are going to continue with the CJCC's jail population review so we can look at cases earlier, flag cases that are low-level offenders that seem to indicate that maybe someone is still in jail pretrial because they just can't afford bond versus them being dangerous to the community. And we're going to screen cases earlier. We are putting together a team to look at the cases that get dismissed most often for insufficient evidence. And we're looking at those cases within a week or two versus in the normal months and the normal course that it would take for that case to come to trial or to come up. But in screening those cases and taking the top cases that get dismissed in the long run anyway and doing that quicker, the rising tide will raise all boats. And because African Americans are arrested more frequently and disproportionately, it will affect them in a better way to have those cases gone. But more than that, we're doing training with law enforcement to teach them what it takes to have a case that's prosecutable and show them when we can through data that it's really not worth their time, energy, and effort and their safety to make some of these cases in the first place. Because we clearly are seeing a pattern, and again, we're just at the beginning, but we're seeing a pattern of some cases that should have never been made. So we'll continue to look at that. And I also will look at expanding the CJCC into Berkeley County. Because my office is in both counties, we have access to great data and should be able to not have to entirely reinvent the wheel for a CJCC that includes Berkeley County.
Thank you, Solicitor Wilson. Dr. Garducki.
I want to thank my distinguished panelists for their insights and also the audience. The comments have been great to examine. I wish we had more time to address all of the issues and concerns that you've raised, but I think it's it's also emblematic of Charleston and the role that citizens can play and should play in being engaged in this work. So we're pleased and proud to be Charleston's partner in this. As I said, we hold it up as a national model, but it's also the case that the Safety and Justice Challenge funding and support is now being addressed on sustainability. So I hope that we can count on Charleston, the county, its citizens, to recognize the value of the work that's ongoing that you see being discussed today, and the need to continue that, and the support from the community and from the system actors and stakeholders, and the collaboration that we've seen grow up, and the use of data and information, sharing power, setting the table continues. So thank you, and thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garduki, and thank you to each of the panelists who participated in this discussion and all who were involved in organizing this. It certainly has been a pleasure, and I believe a great service to our community to hear about the work that you are doing in your respective areas. Thank you again for being a part of this discussion. And Christy, I will hand it back over to you.
Well, thank you all very much, and it's just such a wonderful, way to conclude this segment. And if you all don't mind, please continue to look at these issues. All of the information that was talked about today, particularly the reports, the data, the information is available online. So please continue to share this information, discuss it, engage with others. The more public support there is, the better the Charleston Forum can do at helping to lift these conversations up and hopefully drive some action above and beyond Charleston to spread beyond this to the rest of the state. So thank you so much, y'all. I hope you have a great day, and we hope to see you again at our next event. Thank you so much.